Well, thank you very much for being with us. My name's Mike Saunders, and I'm the vicar here, and so it's my job to welcome you. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for sorting out where you're going to park and all those logistics. And now you're here, you can relax. There is a green programme for the day if you haven't had one. There's one between 2, and you'll be welcome to have one. Basically, the thing you need to know is there's 2 talks before coffee, and coffee's at 11:10. Let me just pray. Father, thank you. Thank you for this building. Thank you for the eco-church movement. Thank you, Father, that we, the church, are learning how to better care for creation. And Father, thank you for our partners, especially those from Heat, who have encouraged us and worked with us and enabled us to do so much of what we've done. And Lord, we just pray now that you'd help us, each and every one of us, to hear your call and have courage to walk in obedience to your call. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Many of you know our bishop. Our bishop is Bishop Olivia, Bishop of Reading. And she probably in the Church of England she's not the lead, but she's probably second in terms of promoting environmental things. And she leads in environmental things for our diocese. And in this last week has announced £10 million worth of investment into vicarages to try and help vicarages to be green eventually. She planned to be with us, and we've been in her diary for more than 6 months. But she went to the clergy conference and caught COVID. What worries me slightly is there were 400 clergy at the clergy conference, and I wonder what's happening on Sunday. But she has sent us a letter from her because she really would like to have been here. And she has sent us a letter and asked me to read it, and I'm very pleased to do that. So, dear sisters and brothers, as people of faith, we believe that God made the earth and all that is in it. He made it very good. He gave us the responsibility to care for it. There's no greater existential threat to human life on earth than the global climate and wider environmental emergency. It affects right now millions of people across the world, destroying lives and livelihoods. It also affects the balance of the intricate web of life as species become extinct at a terrifying rate, and the biodiversity on which we depend is lost. I'm extremely disappointed not to be with you today, but I was never the main act. Today you have a wonderful lineup of speakers and panelists. Dr. Mike Morecroft, a nationally and internationally recognized expert in the field. I'm not even embarrassing you today, Mike, it's someone else. A lead author of the IPCC report. Dr. Margot Hodson, a very well-known and respected environmental, theological and educator. And then Helen Stevens from A Rocha, UK, who passionately believes that there's a huge role for churches in being part of a movement for change. The problems facing us are immense, but they're not insurmountable. If we each play our part, that's the key thing for each of us to remember. Please bear it in mind today. Every small action that we take, every small change that we make is important. Workshops this afternoon will focus on highly practical actions: heating, driving, wildflower meadows, tree planting, and the journey towards becoming an eco-church. I'm absolutely delighted that St. Lawrence has fulfilled all the requirements for reaching the Silver Eco-Church Award, one of only a handful in the diocese which has so far gained this, and I had hoped to have the honour of presenting this today. Huge congratulations for what you've achieved, and huge thanks for the wonderful example that's set. I know that today will be wonderful, educational and inspiring. I also know that it'll be full of hope and that you'll go away encouraged. God bless you all today. Bishop Olivia, Bishop of Reading. So I'm sorry if you But I'm quite pleased she's not giving me COVID, so. So we're going to begin with Dr. Mike Morecroft. Mike is with us every Sunday, Sunday by Sunday. I've been a vicar 33 years, and it wasn't until I met Mike that we started doing Eco Things. The story began on a Wednesday evening when, with great faith really, Mike, you came and set up a talk here, and I wasn't present, but 80 people showed up on a Wednesday evening to hear about the climate change. And as I heard the feedback from that, I learned that actually they wanted us to do tree planting, and so that's what we've done. Mike himself is immensely well qualified. I'm not going to tell all that story, but the key thing is he works for Natural England, and he also is one of the International Intergovernmental Partnership Board Climate Change authors. So basically there's 400 people who meet on Zoom, and they wrote the IPCC reports. So when the Ukraine and Russia were fighting each other, they had both Ukrainian and Russian representatives in the room talking about climate change. How amazing is that? So let's put our hands together. Let's encourage Mike. I'm sure you're going to find this interesting.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's nice to be here in person, not on Zoom, and it's nice not to have to travel too far. It took me all of 8 minutes to walk here, I think, this morning, so that's marvellous. So I'm going to set the scene, really, in terms of the science. What's the challenge that we face as individuals, but also as a human race? I don't think that's overstating the case. And I want to talk a little bit about the science of climate change and also of the threats faced by nature, by biodiversity. As Mike's alluded to, I have a number of roles. My day job, if you like, the job I'm paid for, is with Natural England, the government conservation body for England, where I give advice about how to look after the environment better in the context of climate change to protect species and habitats. I'm also a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to give it the correct term, which has produced over the years really the authoritative global statements of the state of the climate and the effects. And I'll tell you a bit more about that as we go along. And finally, the final logo on that introductory slide is the John Ray Initiative, which is a Christian organization which has worked to develop our understanding of the interactions between that science and Christian faith and theology. And it's a real delight that we've got Margot speaking after me, and then Martin Hodson at the back there, looking inconspicuous, and do speak to them afterwards, as also, of course, Helen and Arosha. Wonderful people to share this platform with. So, without further ado, let's go on. I will say I am speaking really in my personal capacity. So, everything I'm going to present to you, I would say, is 100% solidly science-based, but it's my words rather than any of those individual organisations. So I'm going to talk then about biodiversity loss first, and then go on to climate change, and then I'll try and weave those two themes together towards the end, because they are two linked crises that we face as a world. They're not entirely separate. I'm going to talk a lot about the findings from big reports. That's the pile of books cartoon there. I do that because it's really important, I think, to say this isn't my hobby horse, this isn't my views. This is my best attempt to summarize the views of not a few people, but literally hundreds of experts from all different countries around the world. But it is, I hope, livened up a little by my experience working with Natural England, and look what I've learned from being outdoors, looking at nature myself, and working with colleagues. So the first of the big reports, not from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but from the International Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. You don't have to remember that, but it's a big authoritative report. That's the one on the left. The one on the right is for the UK on the state of nature. And just some headline messages. So from the international report, this is what's happening in terms of extinctions over time. If you look along the bottom of the graph, you can see a time axis going back to 1500. And you can see for each of these different groups of species, from amphibians at the top to fish at the bottom, you can see a rising trend. More and more species going extinct, and particularly in the last 100 years. We're having a big impact. Those are human impacts almost entirely. And the threat continues. And so this again is a series of different groups of organisms, plants and animals. And this shows the proportion of them that are at risk of extinction in these different groups. Those that are in green are the ones of least concern, those in red are at the most concern. But you can see between 5 to 10% of pretty much every species group is at a high risk of extinction, but moderate risks of extinction are there for a very large number of different species. So it's a big threat. And I'm trying. All right, there we go. What about in Britain then? Is this a problem just for the other side of the world? Well, no, actually. 15% of species in Britain are today at risk of extinction. And 133 of those that have been assessed have actually already become extinct in Great Britain. And when we look since 1970, you can see that more species have declined than have increased. So why is this all happening? Well, it's a series of different pressures. To date, the most serious ones have been around changes in agricultural practice and the way we use land. Increasingly, as we look into the future, climate change goes up the agenda, and I'll say more about that as we go on. But you can see there are a number of other factors there around, for example, pollution or non-native invasive species that we've spread around the world, mostly through international trade. And we shouldn't just think that these are things that are nice to have. Actually, we depend on nature. And this gentleman, Siddhartha Dasgupta, led a very influential review of the economics of biodiversity. So he's an economist, he's not an environmentalist, but he did a review for the UK Treasury a year or two ago. And this is what he said in introducing that review. We're facing a global crisis. We are totally dependent on the natural world. It supplies us with every oxygen-laden breath we take, every mouthful of food we eat. But we are damaging it so profoundly that many of its natural systems are now on the verge of breakdown. So as I say, this is an economist, very well-respected professor at Cambridge. So there's a threat there to us as well as to the intrinsic value of the species that we share this planet with. But I'm going to throw in some hope at this point, and I'm aware this could be a very gloomy talk, and I don't want you to go away hopeless. I want you to go away challenged. But there is still hope, and recovery is still possible. And I don't know, we've got people here from a wide range of different areas, but my guess is a lot of you, when you look at the skies, there's a fair chance of seeing a red kite circling. Certainly true in Hungerford. When we first moved to Hungerford 20-odd years ago, we didn't see any, or it was an extremely rare event. Now it's a daily thing. And the red kites were introduced to this part of the country from Spain. They'd died out in most of Britain, just a few remnant populations, and they were brought back, protected, and they've thrived. The slightly less glamorous picture on the right is a peat bog in Cumbria, Bolton Fell Moss, which was extracted for horticultural peat. And that's just as beautiful to me. It was bare peat. I saw it, and it was a desert of peat, bare, releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, not a wild species in sight. But the water table was increased, and efforts were made to to recover it, and it is now coming back to life, and the sphagnum moss is starting to colonize and all the other species. So recovery is possible, but we have to work at it. Now I'm going to move on to climate change, and as Mike's pointed out, a large part of my life for the last few years has been around the middle one of these three reports. So every few years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produces what they call assessment reports. They come in three parts. The one on the left is all about the physical science, the climate itself. The one in the middle is about the impacts of climate change and how we can adapt to reduce those impacts. And then the one on the right is what's called the mitigation of climate change. So this is all about how you can actually practically reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are the cause of climate change, anthropogenic, human-caused climate change. And hundreds of authors were involved in that, I've mentioned that already, but also hundreds of people were involved in reviewing it, and all of them had to prove their scientific credentials to be allowed to do that, but nevertheless, hundreds of people were involved in that review, and finally, all of the conclusions, the headline conclusions, are signed off by government representatives. And there's always a debate about that, whether that's actually watered things down a bit. I have to say from my experience, that wasn't the case. We have to be very careful not to tell governments what to do. We're giving them the information on which they can then make the decisions. But these have been tested pretty much to destruction by the governments in asking questions in some very intense sessions. So I can tell you more about at coffee if you're interested. I'm going to dip in and out of the different reports over the next few minutes. I'm not going to say so much about the physical science. There was a time when I would have come and given a talk like this and I'd have explained how the greenhouse effect worked and how CO2 levels were rising and all of that sort of climate science. That is really now extremely well established. I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm not going to spend so much time on it because it seems to me the question is, what do we do about it? But the Working Group 1, the climate science report, they've gone through different stages about how clear they are that human activities are causing the current climate change we see. And they've gone through things like the balance of evidence suggests. And where it is at now is that the evidence of anthropogenic climate change, human-caused climate change, is unequivocal. That's the current term. I'm not sure what they're going to do in their next report in 7 or 8 years' time. I feel we've sort of gone as far as we can. Warming of just over 1 degree Celsius has already happened. We know that. The evidence is really strong from meteorological records around the world. What is new, though, is understanding that we're now seeing a pattern of more extreme events. So these are things like floods, droughts, wildfires. And that's something that the evidence has strengthened for considerably in the last 10 years. And also, perhaps most disturbingly, many of these changes are irreversible over a time scale of centuries, possibly even millennia to come, especially when you think about what happens in the ocean and the ice sheets and to sea level rise. So sea level is rising because the ice sheets are melting, as well as a bit of expansion because water expands as it gets warmer. That takes a very long time to stop. Even if we stop emissions tomorrow, the sea level rise will go on for decades to centuries to come. And that's sort of baked into the system. And when we look at what's happening with greenhouse gas emissions, we are not on track to keep them down to the level of 1.5 degrees of global warming since pre-industrial times, which was agreed by the governments of the world in Paris a few years ago. And you can see these are the different types of greenhouse gases. The big blue block at the bottom is carbon dioxide. That's the biggest one. But you can also see, for example, the red line there, or the red band there, which is methane, is quite an important one. And there are others as well. And the sort of orangey one between the red and the blue is interesting. So that's also carbon dioxide, but not from fossil fuels, but from changes in land use, things like deforestation. So this is where it comes back to the point that actually the natural and the human systems, the climate system and the biodiversity crisis are really quite linked. But the big blue one at the bottom is fossil fuel emissions of carbon dioxide. But so what? Well, this is the so what. Over half the world's population, something like 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. And remember, this isn't a back-of-the-envelope calculation. This is based on a very careful analysis by experts working in the field. Why are they vulnerable? Well, it's partly because of climate change, but it's also because of a number of other factors that make people more vulnerable. Limited access to water, sanitation and healthcare, livelihoods that are very dependent on climate. If you're a subsistence farmer and you have a drought, you'll have a bigger problem than we do. High levels of poverty. If you're poor, you can't buy your way out of a problem. You're often the ones who live in the places that most are at risk. And we see it even in our own inner city areas sometimes, in the UK, and globally it's even more true. If you have a house that won't keep the rain out, what do you happen with a more intense storm that we will get in future? And then there's a number of other factors of weak leadership in planning, lack of funding. You know, if you haven't got the money as a country to defend yourself against flooding or adapt to it, what are you going to do? And there is a lack of accountability in some places in trusting government. And that's a theme that we found increasingly, that the risks of climate change are multiplied by all these other factors. So climate change combines with unsustainable use of natural resources, habitat destruction, growing urbanization and inequity. Just to give you one example of a change that's happened with serious consequences for people and for nature. So this is the area of wildfire, area burnt by wildfires in the western United States, so places like California. And the top line shows you what's actually happened. The bottom one, the sort of yellowy bit, shows you what would have happened without climate change. And this is really new research over the last decade that we've been able to, I say we, it's not my work, but that scientists have been able to tease apart what effect climate change has had in it. Because there would have been fires anyway, for a number of reasons, including the way forests are managed. But you can see it has more than doubled the area burnt. And I was in California a few years ago during a wildfire season in the summer. And you know, you could see the kind of smoke across the landscape over hundreds of miles. It's become a really big matter of life and death for people in some parts of the western US. This is probably, on these screens, it's probably hard to see the detail here, but we can also see changes in the natural environment. And if you look at the big picture of that map, you'll see there's blocks of different colored areas. And those are the biomes of the world. So they're things like areas where tropical rainforest occurs or areas of desert. And all the little symbols show where there's been a change in the boundary of those grand patterns of vegetation at a global scale. We're seeing changes. We're seeing the northern tree line expanding into the tundra. We're seeing tree lines on mountains changing. We're seeing changes around the edges of tropical forests and savannas. So change is happening now. It's not a hypothetical. And when we look at species, and as an ecologist, this is one of the areas I work on, you can see threats that are happening, well, more than threats, impacts that are happening now. I'm tempted to say which is the odd one out here, and there's any number of answers you could give to that question, depending how you frame it. But I'm going to cut it short. So the one at the bottom right, which you're probably going to say it's a rat or something. Well, no, it's not. It's a bramble cane melanis. You probably have never heard of it. It lived I was going to say it lived in the past tense, because it's now extinct. It lived on a low-lying island between Australia and Papua New Guinea, and with rising sea level, its habitat disappeared and it became extinct. There's probably 3 species which we can say there's a clear link to, between extinction and climate change at the moment. But there's a lot more risks out there. We can see the top left there, corals bleaching, warm water corals, places like the Great Barrier Reef. This is what happens during a warm year, and it's very well documented now. You get this bleaching effect. With time, they can recover, but if you keep getting those warm marine heat waves, as they're called, it won't have time to recover. On the right there is an African penguin from South Africa, on the very fringes of where penguins survive. And they're at threat from climate change. And there's a lot of effort going in, actually, to see how they can be protected against that. And then bottom left, just to bring it back to the UK, a mountain ringlet butterfly species. It's very unusual for butterflies in the UK to target on cold areas, but this is one. And we can already see that its distribution in England is starting to retract to the top of the mountains. So the threat to nature is real and being realized in many cases. I'm trying to move on now. There we go. So it's no great surprise, but some habitats are particularly vulnerable. And there are cold places, montane habitats are vulnerable in the UK. Wetland habitats are, because we're seeing changes in rainfall patterns with drier summers. And on the coasts, there's a threat from the rising sea level. When we did an assessment of our national nature reserves that Natural England run here in England, we assessed the different features for which those nature reserves have been established to see whether, and so a feature could be a habitat or it could be a species. And they were colour-coded according to the risk from climate change. Red, amber, green, traffic lights. And you can see that more than half are either moderate or high risk from climate change. So it's not a hypothetical, it's not the far side of the world, it's a risk that's here today. And every small increment in warming matters. Every fraction of degree matters. So it's something like those warm water corals. They're very, very close to their thermal limits. It only needs a little rise to trigger them over the top. And so looking to the future, for people and for nature, what can we see? We can see rising effects of heat stress, probably more, today's a good day to say it after yesterday, isn't it? You know, the effects of a hot day in summer. Water scarcity, though, the changes in rainfall patterns, and knock-on effects onto things like food security and flood risk from rising sea levels and from more intense storms in some places. And that also has a number of knock-on effects through nature, to things like pollination, food sources, tourism even. One thing that comes out, though, is that it's not the same risk everywhere. Different parts of the world are at different risks. You can see it globally. Even within a relatively prosperous continent like Europe, you can see, perhaps unsurprisingly, that some risks are greater in southern Europe because they're already hotter, and it only requires that small uplift in temperature to start to get into the place where heat stress on human beings becomes much more important. And the statistic there is that the amount of time at which people are in a stressful temperature could rise by as much as 74% in southern Europe. There's a threshold above which human beings start to suffer the effects of heat stress in a big way. We in the UK rarely reach that point, don't we? But we do occasionally, you know, when you start to get temperatures well into the 30s. So it is still a risk to us, especially because we're not prepared. But if you're in southern Europe, the impacts are that much greater because, you know, what was the low 30s becomes the high 30s, and then you're getting into really quite dangerous temperatures for people. And The figures on the right are just some of the modelling of how climate might change in future. And another point about that link between nature and climate is that as the impacts of climate change increase, the impacts on natural systems increase, and that in turn reduces their capacity to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. As we know, things like planting trees is great because they take carbon out of the atmosphere. It's not so great when they die because they get affected by a drought or an extreme heat wave. And there is actually more carbon in our soils and forests than there is in fossil fuels. So if we see a large-scale loss of that carbon from trees dying or peat drying out, there's an awful lot of carbon in peat, which can go into the atmosphere when it dries out, then we're going to get a situation where actually more climate change increases the causes of climate change, and you get a sort of vicious circle that makes a bad problem worse. So what do we do about it then? I'm going to try and steer us back to some optimism. There's two things we can do. We can adapt now to reduce vulnerability to the climate change that is happening and is inevitably going to increase even if we stopped emissions today. The climate system has this inertia in it, things like sea level rise being baked into it. So we've got to do something to reduce those risks. But obviously we also want to reduce the causes of climate change, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what's often called mitigation. And there are options we can take to reduce the risks in the here and now. And we are seeing around the world, people are taking action on adaptation to reduce those risks. The trouble is, the progress is uneven and we're not adapting fast enough. The climate is changing faster than we are adapting. But what are some of those things we can do to reduce risks? Well, there are a lot, and I'm only going to pick out a few of these. But there's things like better flood defences. In some places, that may mean natural flood defences and actually allowing coastal habitats like salt marsh to re-establish where they've been lost. But in other places, somewhere like London, that's not going to do it. So things like the Thames Barrier remain really important, and thinking about the flood defence of major cities is a big issue for adaptation around the world. There's things around agriculture, about better irrigation, about better cultivars, better varieties adapted to change. We can plant shade trees like they do in southern European cities, if you think of a beautiful square in the Mediterranean that provides shade. We know those kind of places in towns are cooler than a kind of concrete car park effect. And then there's some of the human things that we can do. We can make sure that when there is a heat wave or a flood, that there is the necessary social safety nets there. It's not so much of an issue here, but in some parts of the world, if you get flooded out, there's nowhere to go, there's no one to look after you, you're on your own. Things like insurance. It's notable, one of the first businesses to really engage with this whole issue was the insurance business. It's an existential threat to them if they get that wrong. So we can do things now to reduce risks, and we certainly should do. But there are some limits to adaptation. For example, the issue about trees dying, we can plant more trees. They can do things like slow flood flow, but if they die because it gets too hot, it's a problem. We can also see a lot of the agricultural techniques. Up to a point, they will work, but it's very hard to grow crops, in a really extreme drought, for example. The human body does have its physiological limits. You can't stay indoors, or you don't want to stay indoors all day, do you? Because it's so warm you can't go out. It's an adaptation measure, but it's not a desirable one. So we need to turn off the tap, if you like, in this overflowing bathtub of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And broadly speaking, when the atmosphere reaches what we call net zero is a fashionable word, basically means what emissions of greenhouse gases are left are balanced off by the processes that take them out of the atmosphere, like, for example, tree growth. I have to say, tree growth only goes a small amount of the way. It's only offsetting at the moment, less than 5% of UK greenhouse gas emissions, and it's not going to get much more than that. But we can get it up a bit. But we need to stabilise greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere globally. And if we can do that by 2050, then we have a reasonable chance of holding global temperature below 1.5 degrees, which will reduce the impacts significantly. If we don't manage it until the 2070s, then we're looking more like 2 degrees, and the problems start to rack up. So there is some urgency there. And if we look at the mitigation options, and this is coming from my colleagues working on the third of the IPCC reports, we can see across all different sectors, energy, land use, industry, urban, buildings, transport, we can see there are options available now. And their estimate is that we can halve emissions by 2030 if we put our mind to it and we actually engage seriously. And costs are coming down. It is becoming more practical. These graphs show over the last 20 years the prices of solar panels, solar power, onshore wind, and also batteries for electric vehicles. And I'm not the expert on electric vehicles, but there are some people here this afternoon who will tell you more about that. But costs are going right down. I mean, the two graphs on the left, if you look carefully, there's a sort of grey bar at the bottom, which is the cost of fossil fuel alternatives. So actually, whereas 20 years ago you could say, well, it's still much cheaper to burn fossil fuel than to have solar panels, actually, that's not true anymore. And there are some nature-based solutions, another fashionable phrase, but planting trees, restoring bogs, creating salt marshes can help to tackle climate change and nature loss and improve the environment for people as well. When we were working on our IPCC report, we focused on, as a sort of concluding thought, the concept of what we call climate resilient development. Because people need to develop, and globally, it's really important that the development isn't stopped, and that people get educated, they have a stable income, a stable food source. But it needs to happen in a way which balances up this need to adapt to climate change that we can't stop, to reduce emissions, to stop it changing anymore, but also enhancing biodiversity and achieving what are called the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a whole series of things which people need for a better quality of life. And if you can't tackle them entirely separately. These are linked issues, as I hope to come out as we've gone along. So we came up with a number of things that we needed to see. So it needs to be dealt with across all of government, but not just government, across all of society. This is all of our problem. It involves everyone. It involves partnership. And it's really great today to see local partnerships here. This is organised by the church, but we're pulling in other Christian groups, but also secular groups as well. And that's great. That's how it should be. Drawing on wide-ranging knowledge. It isn't ultimately a science problem how we solve this. It needs all sorts of different types of knowledges. Practical experience, engineering, agriculture, conservation. And also indigenous knowledge in some parts of the world. That's a really big issue. People who've lived close to the land for millennia. We need to conserve and restore ecosystems. We need to look after and involve marginalised groups. Equity and justice come into it. You've got to have a fair chance to look after yourself. And partnerships aren't going to work unless we can find a way to work with different interests, different values and worldviews. We have to work together. And it does need more investment globally. And it does need international cooperation. And this is almost my final slide, but Mike did mention at the start that when we were getting through the final hurdle in approving the IPCC report that I was involved with, it was actually the time when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we had a number of very moving interventions from Svetlana Krakowska, who was head of the Ukrainian delegation, and she's a well-respected polar scientist. You can see her up and top right in her sort of polar gear, and bottom right, where I guess she is probably today in a flat in Kiev. I have never been to a meeting before when someone said, you know, online working is interesting, but, you know, we will continue to work if we have an internet connection and no missiles over her head. What do you say to that? But her take on it is, and I think this is really important, because at the moment, you know, we know there's the cost of living crisis. We know there's problems with fuel. We know there's problems with food. So, you know, it's very tempting to say, well, we'll put the environment, things like climate change, on hold until we've sorted those out. But it is all linked. So this is what Svetlana said. Burning oil and gas and coal is causing warming and impacts wind to buy weapons. This is a fossil fuel war. It's clear we cannot continue to live this way. It will destroy our civilization. And I can't really think of any other way to really finish this talk other than just to draw out this point that came right at the end of our summary for policymakers, that any further delay in concerted anticipatory action, global action on adaptation and mitigation of climate change will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. I'll finish there. We'll have some questions as a panel when the next two speakers have spoken. Thank you.